So we're 4 minutes past the hour. I think we have quite a lot of attendees already on, so we're good to go. I'll kick off by introducing myself. So Leah Oyman, Market Regulatory Initiatives Manager at Franklin Templeton and part of the SIO Events Management team. Joined today by Capco and a few specialists at Capco who are going to be walking us through the EMIR REFIT changes. So we've all been graced with EMIR requirements for the past few years now. They have changed slightly here and there over the years. However, EMIR REFIT is coming our way in the next couple of years, as understood, and it's going to have quite impactful changes to pretty much all of us in the industry. So I wanted to pass on initially to Sarah O'Callaghan, who is the managing principal at Capco and also the relationship manager for the SIO. And Sarah is going to introduce you to the specialists at Capco who are going to then present for us. Before I do that, just very quickly, some admin notes. We have chat functionality where you can ask questions during the presentation. So you will see on your screen there, if you want to ask a question, press the button, the Q&A button. We'll see the question coming up and we'll address them at particular times during the presentation. We'll also have some polls throughout the presentation to get your feedback on where we stand as an industry for EMIR REFIT. So without further ado, I'll pass on to Sarah.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you to the SIO for having us back again today. So hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's Capco webinar on EMIR REFIT. Thank you for joining us today. This is the 5th in a series of Capco webinar sessions that we've run with the SIO, part of the partnership over the past year. Earlier in the year, we ran something on operational resilience that some of you may have attended, and we do have further plans for future webinars in Q3 and Q4. And hopefully we may get to do something in person one day, maybe later in the year. So I'm Sarah O'Callaghan. As Leah said, I'm a managing principal at Capco in our Edinburgh office and part of the Scotland leadership team. I'm the SIO relationship manager at Capco and have been working closely with Leah and team over the past year, along with the Capco team here to bring things together. The session today will be moderated by Tej Patel, our head of regulation in the UK, who will introduce our speakers soon. But just firstly, before we do that, for those of you that may not know Capco, we are a global management and technology consultancy dedicated to financial services. We have over 5,000 people globally, and I guess more relevantly, we have approximately 230 in our Scotland office currently. You'll see in the slide here that we've had pretty rapid growth for Scotland over the past 5 years. We've got a large regulatory practice in Scotland and UK-wide, and we're also heavily involved in digital transformation and data as well, but it's very much in and around the tech and change space for FS. So with that, I'll hand over to Tej to moderate the session.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. And again, thank you to the SIO for having us to talk about EMIR REFIT. So I'm Tej Patel. As Sarah said, I lead the UK regulatory practice. I've spent time in industry and consulting, so I've been on both sides of the fence and spent more time doing reg change than I'd like to admit. But hopefully in this session, we'll be able to give you a quick, brief overview on EMIR if you've managed to avoid it up till now, in which case you have, congratulations. And then we'll talk about EMIR REFIT and the challenges in there. So in order to take us through this content, we've got two of our experts. So we've got Stephen McPherson, who leads the reg practice from the Scotland perspective, and we've also got Drupal Shah, who leads the reg practice for me in the UK. Both I've got lots of experience from a regulatory perspective and from both a consulting and industry lens as well. So I will now hand over to Stephen to take us through. And before Stephen starts, just to reiterate what Leah had said, please feel free to send any questions. We've got Q&A coming up later on, so it would be great to have questions coming, and I'll be fielding them through to our panelists. So again, thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the session.
Thanks, Tej, and hi everyone. Thanks for joining today. As the other guest said, What I'm going to do today is firstly begin the session by talking through EMIR regulations in general terms, before then moving on to talk a little bit more about the ESMA REFIT programme in more detail, after which I'll then pass on to my colleague Drew, who's going to cover off some of the key considerations of REFIT. In regards of EMIR reporting, EMIR was entered into in August 2012. It was part of the response by the European Parliament to the global financial crisis, which most of you know occurred between 2007 and 2009. Now, this was caused in part by the collapse of the mortgage-backed securities industry, basically subprime lending in the US housing market. And that resulted in the bankruptcy of many financial services firms such as Lehman Brothers. EMIR initially implemented to cover some of the asset classes for OTC derivatives in 2012. The exchange traded derivative reporting was then added around 2015. Incidentally, the US equivalent to this is the Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform of 2010, which was introduced to promote stability in the US financial markets and protect the US consumers. The reason EMIR came into force was to monitor, control, and give greater transparency to the OTC derivative market in the first instance. It was designed to give adherence to regulations by market participants for both financial counterparties and non-financial counterparties. It related to the rules submitting to trade repositories and the reduction of risk for both counterparties and operationally. And it was also introduced to monitor for any possible market abuse or manipulation by any EU member firms that trade within the EU, and also non-EU entities that are trading with their EU counterparties. Following the initial deployment of EMIR, EMIR 2 was then introduced in October 2017, and that was designed to improve the accuracy and the efficiency of the reporting. At this point in time, 87 new data points and 61 reportable fields spread by asset class were introduced. One gap that did get identified fairly early in EMIR 2.0 was the lack of guidance on formatting of reports, and that's something we're going to touch later on as part of this presentation. Moving on to the next part of the presentation, the EMIR regulation can actually be separated into three main categories. The reporting obligation, which is Article 9, clearing obligation, which is Article 4, and risk mitigation. In regards of report obligation, that covers things like trade state reporting, as well as collateral and valuations, which are reported on a daily basis and reported for any open positions. Other things to consider are trading venues, which relate to non-regulated markets, and also third country equivalent markets. And that's particularly relevant now that the UK has exited Brexit and the passporting rules around how they trade with their counterparts in the European market. It's also worth considering the trade reporting rules, which are important. You know, trades need to be confirmed, you know, reports need to be submitted within T+1. And there's also some strict back reporting rules to bring things up to the most recent standard. EMIR is also unique in that it's got delegated reporting and it's dual-sided, which is slightly different to some of our counterparts in North America, for instance, or Canada. Moving on to clearing. Clearing covers things like netting obligation and exposure, as well as the role as the center counterparty. The center counterparty should work as a kind of mediation between the two counterparties to the trade, and they're an authorized legal person that is responsible for monitoring the risk between those counterparties. Clearing thresholds are also important as part of this. You know, they are based by asset class, and clearing thresholds range between 1 and 3 billion euros, depending on the asset class that is getting traded. There's also obligations on clearing members and rules around client segregation. Moving on to risk mitigation, that's a monitoring of the operational risk. It's important, you know, for certain reasons such as capital requirements. The financial counterparty is required to hold adequate capital and cover any of their exposure to risk in the market, and this should include any earnings or any capital reserves that they hold. And it also covers operational credit risk as well as any risk to the counterparty. Collateral and valuation is also an important part of this. That is required for any open trades on a daily basis, and it's also based around the mark-to-market of the value of the contract. The final point worth noting in regard of risk mitigation is the margin. Market participants have to exchange initial and variation margin of any OTC derivatives that they cleared on that haven't cleared on the exchange. The variation margin covers the current exposure of their position, and the initial margin is the future exposure to the counterparty that they're trading with. There does exist some exceptions to this, for instance, intra-group transactions, which are relevant for NFC minuses. We'll come on to a little bit more in detail. So REFIT program was introduced as part of the ESMA's regulatory fitness program. It impacts financial services firms, central counterparties, any CCPs and trade repositories that have an obligation to report derivatives under the EU regulation. The first part of REFIT came into force on the 17th of June 2019, and it was implemented to improve the implementing technical standards. This is essentially the format, the scope of the reporting, and the frequency of the submissions to the trade repositories, and also the regulatory technical standards, which is essentially the data to be reported. Moving on to the next part of the presentation and the scope of the ESMA review. The initial scope of the review was to look at all financial services firms and repositories that dealt with derivatives, review the data quality standards, and reconcile any standards of critical data elements. There was also rules around the registration of TRs. The outcome of that review was that there was no fundamental changes required, but however, there were identified disappropriate rules and costs for small financial firms, which are known as NFC minus, and they were classified on level of trading against the clearing thresholds. It also required increased transparency for trade repositories. It addressed insufficient access to clearing and data for some parties to the trade. There were also identified some insufficient rules on data requirements and reporting formats, the data reported to the TRs, and the reconciliation and the validation of data. In regards of timeline, phase 1 of REFIT was delivered on the 18th of June 2020. Things that were delivered at that point, and the main one being mandatory delegated reporting. This was designed to remove the onerous rules and costs to the NFC minus, or ones that fall under the threshold. And it put the responsibility on a large financial counterparty, such as investment banks or insurance brokers, to report on behalf of the small counterparties for any derivatives that they trade. Incidentally, the NFC can still report on their own behalf if they chose to. It also implemented some exception rules for NFC trading outside of the EU for small counterparties and ESMA equivalent markets, and additional rules for NFCs where they were intra-group trading or trades that were happening between the same legal entity, between one or more party. There were also additional rules implemented for alternative investment funds and pension administrators, in regards of how they would report OTC derivatives and take responsibility for that. One point worth noting at this point is that NFC is exempt from clearing, but they are still subject to the risk mitigation and the margin requirement rules of ESMA and of FCA. I'm now going to talk a little bit more about REFIT or 3.0 as it's become adopted within the industry. I'm going to talk through the dates and approvals of some key challenges for that, after which I'm going to pass to my colleague Drew, who's going to cover off the key considerations in a little bit more detail. In regards of timeline, so we've covered off REFIT phase 1 and the technical standards. At this point in time, or around this period, in fact, the 30th of June, the EU was expected to adopt the technical standards and submit them to the EU Parliament. Around the end of July, the Parliament is expected to adopt the standards and then submit them to the EU Parliament. At that point, the EU Parliament will publish and enforce the mandated approach. Now, at this point in time, we don't have a set date for that, but we do expect it to be somewhere around August 2021. And from that point, there will be around 18 months to deliver that. Moving on to some of the key changes to EMIR 3.0. And the first one I want to cover off is the amount of new fields that are getting introduced. There are going to be 160 new fields that are implemented for EMIR. Now, this compares to 128 fields for CFTC in North America, for instance. And there are a lot of commonalities around the implementation of the CFTC Dodd-Frank rule rewrite at this point in time. And that's going to deliver around similar dates to EMIR REFIT. It's expected that it will be over an 18-month period, and they've established that 60% of the fields are common between both mandates. So some of the rules that are going to be implemented relate to those standards being met and having a consistent approach across the industry. Some of the other key fields that people that are responsible for trading derivatives or reporting them to trade repositories should consider at this point in time are things like notional schedules that are required up front. post-trade risk reduction, which is the mitigation of fields and some clearing exemptions and compressions for smaller counterparties. The reporting of delta or the price movement of the underlier. This is something that will need to be reported and may not be readily available in front office systems at this point in time. Also, similarly, the overall package price is the spread of the position, and that's also something that may not be captured in front office systems by some firms. So a recommendation at this point in time would be that firms start to look at these specifications for EMIR and they consider what they do have in their upstream systems that are getting captured and fed down to the downstream systems. One of the other substantial changes is the changes to event and action type. So action type has always been there, but has been increased, and event type has been introduced as a new requirement. And what this has resulted in is around 33 different scenarios for trade reporting when we consider all event types and all action types. So things that firms should be doing is look to map their business events from front office, and as they flow downstream, consider what action or what event that these would be relevant for. And also compare their validation rules against the 3.0 spec to make sure that what they are doing at this point in time is business ready for what's going to be implemented over the next 18 months. Some of the event types to consider are things like step-ins, where another counterparty comes into the trade, rules around clearing, the exercise of a position, and things like allocations and corporate actions are important too. I'll briefly skim over some of the other points, and then I'm going to pass over to Drew to cover the other key considerations. But at a high level, ISO 20022 is to implement the global standards in a new consistent message format for all global harmonization of trades that are relevant across multiple jurisdictions. This was already implemented by SFTR last year. However, the size and scale of EMIR determines that this will be a much more difficult implementation and much larger scale, and given financial firms like yourself much more to consider. Pairing and matching rules have also been enhanced, and there's 102 new fields that people need to consider for pairing and matching. This is going to require full remediation procedures to be written by operational firms, and ensuring that workflows are in place to cover how they'll go through those stages. In preparation to that, I would suggest that counterparties or other financial firms, and certainly larger ones, need to engage with their other counterparties at this stage in time, ensure that the consistency of data that they currently report is there, that they are considering what the new fields will be, and also things that they are needing to remediate or where they've got failures in the reporting at this point in time. They consider, can they remediate that ahead of starting to build for EMIR 3.0. Just to touch on a couple of other things, unique product identifier is a new field for OTC derivatives. For trades that are traded outside of the exchange, then that is going to replace the need for an ISIN to be submitted on your report. It will be required to source data from the Derivatives Service Bureau, so there's going to be the need to connect with a third party. You're going to have to identify the trade referential data for a unique product identifier and consider the instruments underneath that at your underlier level from the data tables that you store down. Unique trade identifier is also going to introduce a waterfall logic, and that's part of wider global reform of harmonization. So again, people like the CFTC, the Commodities Future, and the Canadian Securities Commission are also looking to implement this. And if you are reporting across multiple regimes for specific trades, then you need to consider that you're going to have to implement this across all of those areas. So, consider the jurisdiction impact for your firm, and also we are going to decommission or see the decommission of the unique swap identifier for commodities and all other derivatives. So that is going to be replaced by this unique trade identifier across the board. The last thing before passing over to Drew is the need to report to the competent authorities and give them better access to data. So at the moment in time, the reporting of emissions or breaches is not mandated. It will become mandated under REFIT. And sharing your pairing and matching and report status with your delegated clients and counterparties will also be a mandated approach for this. So you need to inform your delegated clients on your reporting status and any data quality issues that you have on your reports. Final point to note, LEIs tend to lapse every 12 months. And if you don't keep them up to date or your counterparty does not keep them up to date, then that's going to result in a failure on your part or on their part to report successfully. So although it's a very small thing, it could have a large impact to the market if people aren't taking responsibility to maintain their LEIs. Thanks, guys. At this point, I'm going to pass over to Drew. He's going to cover off some of the key considerations. So over to you, Drew.
Thanks, Stephen. So from a key consideration perspective, there's 10 areas that Capco believe all firms should be cognizant of when addressing the sort of EMIR refit. So from a data perspective, there's two core things that are changing and have been proposed as changes for EMIR 3.0. So there is the concept of critical data elements, and that is a recommendation from EMIR from ESMA to adopt CD methodology across all reporting for EMIR. And I think what should be noted by organizations is that ESMA has stated that this must be consistently applied and should not diverge in any way from the principles that they have laid out. The other core component across data is that and it is still in the consultation paper, is that they are proposing that the ISO 20022 reporting format be adopted for all OTC derivative contracts using the standardized template methodology. So those are the sort of two core kind of data changes, and the only sort of area of contention is that ISDA has raised concerns over the intention of ESMA to adopt the ISO 20022 technical data standards, purely stating that it'll place an additional burden on firms. It creates inconsistencies, and it sort of deviates from what was implemented for SFTR, which was one of the, I guess, more recent larger ones to go live. So that from a data perspective, I think those are kind of the key considerations that we've identified the firms need to be aware of. And of course, some of these are still in consultation, so we will see. I guess we'll see where they eventually end up. The next piece is, and very relevant for sort of FCA regulated firms, is there is an anticipation that there is going to be divergence from the FCA compared to what what ESMA and other NCAs implements. So although the FCA has clearly stated that there won't be any divergence in terms of timelines, and they expect to follow the same timelines as ESMA. What is still under review with the FCA is the technical standards, which were scheduled to be published which are still scheduled to be published in Feb 2021. From a backloading perspective, our expectation is that, or rather ESMA's expectation is that live trades trades that were live on the refit go live dates, there will be an expectation to back report these. We fully expect that there will be at least a 6-month grace periods for reporting firms to get those re-reported, and as per other regulations have been taken live by the NCAs, we don't expect any sort of enforcement action from NCAs for a period of at least 6 months as a grace. So we are anticipating a 6-month grace period on the backloading components. Stephen, could you move to the next slide? Oh, perfect. The next stage then is the next component then is post-trade risk reduction. So our expectation is that with this component, that unique trade information attributes for compressions and netting will need to be exchanged between brokers and service providers, and that's purely to ensure that trades that are exempt from reporting are correctly identified and not reported. From a action type and event type perspective, our expectation is fully that that ESMA has taken the opportunity to amend and increase the use of action type and introduce event types. whilst this has been widely welcomed by the industry as a whole, there is further clarification that people are looking for in terms of how will you practically use these use the action type and event type. From a reconciliations perspective, with the additional fields, there is a expectation that there'll be a significant increase in the number of fields that are being reconciled and matched between counterparties. Our view at the moment is that a high proportion of these fields are purely transactional data, which in theory should be agreed upfront by both counterparties to the trade, making this sort of additional level of matching somewhat negated. But there is a challenge where there are going to be some reconcilable fields that may also there may be no requirement to report a value for a particular asset class, instrument, or event, and hence what we are expecting organization or firms to do to address this is they'll need to have, I guess, better tolerance levels to allow the sort of possibility of mandatory versus, I guess, optional fields and how you reconcile those to prevent large sort of volumes of breaks appearing on the reconciliation processes. Stephen's already touched on the unique product identifier, so I won't go into much depth there, but the expectation is that the new identifier for products be reported in addition to current ICN or CFI that is being reported at the moment. And our view is that although ISIN will likely remain in scope for ETD, the UPI will potentially provide enough information to be the only source required for OTC trades. Our current view is that the CFI code is likely to be a duplicate of information provided by the UPI, but we'll see how that, I guess we'll see how that pans out once a consultation and review of the technical standards is completed. And then the final component or final key consideration that we're advising organizations on at the moment is pairing and matching. So there will be stricter requirements for the EMIR REFIT pairing and matching, as there's an additional 102 new fields, as Stephen covered earlier. And the expectation there, and I'm just sort of iterating what Stephen stated, is the expectation there is that firms will need to have clear written procedures for handling the reconciliation of breaks. And we expect there to be, we expect that organizations will need stronger engagement with key counterparties where they have had where they've historically had a high level of trading to remediate misalignment in data reporting and agree sort of consistent reporting criteria to make the pairing and matching process more efficient and to account for the fact that it is significantly increasing in size and scope. That was all. I guess that's all I had to cover on the key considerations. So Stephen, back to you.
Thanks, Drew. Okay, before we move on to the final part of the presentation, we're going to do a quick poll for everyone on the call. Now, there is an option here to say not sure, and what I would say is, if you have any questions, and hopefully everyone is following it at this point in time, but if you have any questions, please use the chat function to submit any, and we'll be happy to cover them off at the end. So, whilst you're doing that, if you want to start voting now, I'll just cover off some key facts or some interesting facts for reporting regulations, which, when it comes to reporting regulations, aren't easy to find. But, firstly, the value of the derivatives market globally is estimated to be around $15.5 trillion in dollars. So, that's a massive number and a massive market that we are trading in. Also, the first modern day regulation was implemented by the Dutch in 1610, and that was an implementation on a ban on short selling. And the first trading of commodities occurred around 8,500 BC, and that was trading of crop production and livestock. And the value of that was dependent on weather, conflict, and as well as supply and demand. So, that's very similar to the things that impact us in regards of trading at this point in time today as well, from all those years ago. I see we've got the results of our poll, and not really surprising, that reporting of fields is one of the key considerations, given that it's 160 fields that everyone is going to have to consider. Some of them are new, some of them will be slight deviation to what we do at this point in time, but it is going to be substantial work, and hopefully we can cover off any questions people have on that as we go forward. I'm going to now move on to how firms should prepare, or some of the steps that we recommend, based on the work that we do with clients that we have been supporting in EMIR, and also supporting in regards of some of the preparation that they're doing for EMIR REFIT. So we're going to cover off some of those steps now, and hopefully everyone finds this useful in regards of what their takeaways are from today. So the first one to cover off is the engagement with counterparties. I did touch on that before. Pairing and matching is obviously substantial now. SFTR had to implement that as part of their deployment, but EMIR is now going to have to follow suit. And given there are substantial amount of new pairing and matching fields to consider, and that the transparency has got to be there for any breaches, and transparency has got to be there for any of your counterparties, then a lot of work needs to be done up front. And you are going to essentially have 18 months from when this is fully mandated in August. And although that sounds like a long time, when you start to consider the challenges upstream, and that your front office system may not even store some of the information that you're going to need to report, then that gives hopefully a sense of the size and scale of the challenges that will take place over the next 18 months. Internal controls are vitally important. Control frameworks. I'm sure everyone has remediation of control framework as a book of work, or are currently implementing controls around the storage, the reconciliation of their data. So I think it's important to review that and consider all the additional fields that we talked about, and any potential changes to the data that's flowing down from upstream, and how that will impact your current logic that's been implemented there. Data quality is vitally important. We are going to adopt a CDE approach, so common data element approach, which will be consistent across the jurisdictions and the industry, and will be a massive challenge to how people report. So do you have the correct data in your front office systems? And have you considered how quickly you generally get to change front office systems, and how you engage with them generally when they are probably more inclined to be worrying about trading and profit and loss and that type of thing. Back reporting, again, really important. That has to be brought up to the ISO standards and the CDE standards. So therefore, everything that you've got as a live position is going to have to be re-reported on the new standard. It's likelihood there will be some period of transition there, that there often is, and usually ESMA or FCA will allow people to have some kind of respite after they've implemented the code, and allow the back reporting of trades and positions to take place. Something also worth considering is wider reform. I've talked a couple of times around CFTC. They have got a major rule rewrite program that is due to deliver in May 2022. That's as substantial as this change that we're talking about here. And there's a lot of common goals between those deployments, such as the standardization of ISO. So Dodd-Frank reform and CFTC and Canada trading in general will be harmonized here. Also in regards of harmonization, the UTI that we talked about, that is going to be harmonized globally, and that is going to have to result in deployment and engagement between all jurisdictions that you report to make sure your production teams are aware of what the obligation is, and how they monitor their current reporting to make sure it's in line. And finally, across the APAC regime, there's substantial book of work that is due over the next 18 months, such as China derivatives, for instance. So, somewhere around 7-8 substantial changes within those regulations that are going to impact and have to be budgeted for over that period of time. In regards of FCA and divergence, there's been a large impact post-Brexit. It's impacted some London trading, for instance, and some trading that was once OTC now had to be registered as on exchange because of the change to the passporting rules, and the FCA or the UK being recognised as an equivalent market for ESMA. So a lot of work to do there. And the FCA have still to produce their final mandate, as Drew talked about. And the early indications are that there will be some divergence in what their requirement will be for fields. And at the very least, you're going to have to submit a report to both. So for EMIR and for FCA, you need to submit a separate report. You're probably doing that now post-Brexit. With the inclusion of all this other work, then that's going to be substantial. The point I want to make on implementation is just to do your comparison around EMIR 2. You know, EMIR 3.0 is roughly judged to be around 50 to 70% of the effort of EMIR 2. So therefore it is large in scale and it's going to be challenging for the industry. And I would recommend keeping an eye on the industry. What is ESMA sending out? What FCA updates are there? You should at this point in time be engaging with these bodies, and also ISDA host regular working groups and forums, and they are at the forefront of the changes in the engagement with ESMA at this point in time. They have a large influence within the industry, and they did push back on some of the original refit recommendations, and hence ESMA had to go back and review some of those initial findings and recommendations. So joining those type of forums and engaging with ISDA will probably allow you to be fully aware of how things are going to be implemented, any last minute changes, and if there's any changes to the dates, which for anyone that's worked in regulations or delivered within regulations will know that dates tend to move out, or things tend to take a little bit longer than first thought of. That covers off all steps that we recommend at this point in time. There are many more, but at this point in time, we would welcome any questions from anyone on the call. And thanks a lot for taking the time to listen to us as we talk our way through this.
Brilliant. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Drew. I've seen one question come in. So again, as Stephen said, I encourage you to ask questions. One of the questions is, if I'm in scope for transaction reporting, am I also in scope for back reporting and life cycle reporting? Stephen, do you want to take that one? Yeah, you're absolutely still in scope for it. So as soon as the EMIR REFIT is implemented and we have to report in the new standard, anything that you have already submitted that is still a live position will still have to be reported. Now, there's a nuance there, because there's a rule that means that any position that you opened up prior to EMIR reporting back in 2012, incidentally, it may have moved the date slightly into 2014 around this rule, but if you had a position that was live before a certain date, then you may not have to bring up to standard. But certainly, for the highest percentage of your book, you will have to back report those positions and bring them up to the new CDE standards and incorporate the new fields that we're going to implement. Here's a question I was waiting for more to come through. So are financial institutions using EMIR as a means of implementing their strategic agenda from a regulatory perspective? So Drew, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so from what we're hearing from our client stage is that they are, because of the sort of scope of the EMIR change, especially the 102 additional data fields, what we are hearing a lot of clients do is they're using this as an opportunity to do kind of three core things. One is to generally improve their reg reporting data models, because it's quite a significant change to the data requirements for EMIR. So we are seeing some organizations use this as an opportunity to revamp their data models. And when I say revamp, I mean they are using it to sort of improve data lineage, data sourcing, data control, data quality, in readiness for bringing these sort of additional EMIR fields on. The other area that we are seeing firms kind of look to I guess, evolve their kind of operating models in the horizon scanning and sort of traceability space. So with the sort of requirement for EMIR to kind of have improved kind of, traceability and procedures, especially around things like pairing and matching, etc., we are seeing organizations use this as an opportunity to enrich their traceability of not just EMIR, but, MIFIR, SFTR predominantly. And then the final sort of space is generally in that rec space. So, the expectation is that reconciliations are going to get significantly more complex. And what we are seeing organizations do is try to move to try to move their reconciliation away from being very siloed, which they generally are, towards either EMIR REFIT, SFTR, or probably EMIR REFIT in this instance, to something that's significantly more holistic. So what I have seen, one or two organizations do at the moment is actually move things like reconciliation and exception breaks to a auto-routed sort of model, which just improves efficiency in the reg ops teams. I've seen some firms starting to migrate their reconciliation from historic or legacy platforms to something that's a little bit more, or significant, not a little bit more, significantly more flexible. So those are kind of the three areas that I think organizations are improving and taking the sort of EMIR refits as an opportunity to do so, because it is quite a big change.
Okay, brilliant, thank you. Next question. So actually, here's one that's come through, and Steve, I'm gonna pose it to you. So, is Capco doing any market intelligence with OMS providers to understand their preparedness and readiness for field capture and retention?
We have started some of that work actually, and myself and Drew have been dealing with some of our kind of consultants in the space who have been doing some of the field comparison work at this point in time. So at this stage, we're doing a large scale comparison across our firms to what they are reporting at this point in time. Talking or dealing with them in regards of what the key things will be in regards of data changing. But the next step of that would be engaging that wider part of the reform. So at this stage, we haven't, but speaking to Drew and the conversations that we've had, we do plan to do that type of work.
Then just it's different, but I'll pose it. It's not a direct follow-up to that, but I'll pose it to you, Stephen. So, adhering to ISO 222 a while back, are there new changes that need to be considered in this next year?
ISO 20022 is it's not a new format. It's been around the industry for a long period of time. In fact, SFTR successfully deployed it. As I talked about earlier, SFTR is much smaller scale, and it was also a new build for the industry. So there was no existing reports to consider for SFTR as there is for EMIR. So bringing things up to a new format and the back reporting requirements will be substantial. The trade state reporting at this point in time for EMIR is not done in the trade. Well, it's done in a trade state format. It's not done in an XML format. So the architecture for downstream systems will need to change to incorporate those changes. And the backloading of that will need to incorporate that as well. So as I said, anything that you've got live, pre-EMIR and post, I think 2014, will have to be brought up to that standard. So it's the scale of it. I think that's the main challenge. It's not new to the industry. It has been implemented before and implemented successfully before. And I would expect it to be done in that way again. But if firms leave it to a very late stage in this project life cycle, then that's when they're going to have some challenges around it.
Okay, brilliant. And we talked about back reporting before, but is there a view of when a grace period will be confirmed by ESMA, Drew?
I think that, there's been a lot of conversation and with clients around what they expect this to be. And the current expectation is that, most clients are expecting kind of a 6-month grace period, similar to what's happened for other back reporting requirements. Now, of course, the expectation there is that ESMA and, well, the hope is anyway, that ESMA and FCA have exactly the same sort of view on that back reporting component, because otherwise that will complicate matters significantly. But I guess we'll have to see once the FCA and ESMA come back and FCA finish their sort of technical standard review and confirmation around timelines.
And moving to one of the other items that was listed in our poll earlier on, how similar are the new pairing and matching requirements to what was implemented for SFTR? Is that something that can be leveraged or replicated, Stephen?
Yeah, very similar. It's the size and scale that's different, and the 102 new fields that are going to be substantial. A reference as well that most firms that we deal with have got remediation issues. Trying to reconcile data and put controls in place is always challenging, and we've had many conversations around how we can support that for clients. So that is going to be where the challenges lie there for firms that are impacted.
And Drew, from an industry perspective and based on all the conversations we have with clients, what do you think firms are most underprepared for? Stephen or Drew, actually, to be fair, either of you, because you're both having these conversations, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Underprepared, I think, is likely the engagement with other counterparties at this point in time. The firm needs to be talking across the street to make sure when these rules are in place for pairing and matching, for instance, and the reporting of breaches to data, right? If you're not submitting properly and you're not pairing and matching with your counterparties, then there's got to be much more transparency, and that's going to be mandated for you. So that's going to be a big challenge for people. The size and scale of the new fields, EMIR 2.0 implemented a bunch of new fields. I don't have the number to date, but it took it from around 26 up to maybe around 80 plus, that type of thing. So we're jumping up much further than that again, and the new fields are going to be implemented across all different asset classes and all different types of reporting, such as trade state, collateral, and valuation. So to me, that seems the kind of massive scale of work that people need to consider, along with standard of the data that you already store in the upstream systems.
I think the other thing to add there is clients we've spoken, or clients I've spoken to, their focus is very much, they know there's new data coming, they know they've got additional pairing and matching and reconciliation requirements. I think what seems to be, they know it's there, but it's sort of lingering a bit in the background, is there's a lack of acknowledgement of the fact that you are going to, in some instances, and in quite a lot of instances, have to change the way your architecture works, which is a massive undertaking. So to deal with the different data standards and data models and expectations around kind of, XML, etc., there is, I think there's going to be significant work that needs to be done in that technology and architecture space, which a lot of organizations haven't truly begun that journey on the basis that they're still waiting to see exactly what the kind of final what the final sort of guidelines and regulatory view is from ESMA and the FCA. So it is an area that a lot of clients are concerned about, but not much they can really do. Not much they can do about it just yet, because they don't want to kick off an engagement until they've got a little bit more clarity as to what's coming.
I think if we were to kind of summarize for our audience as to what we believe is fundamental to getting EMIR refit right, and yes, there's a lot we still need to get clarity from the regulatory bodies. What would you kind of say would be fundamental in your view?
I'll take that and then give Stephen a chance. So I think from my perspective, the three things to get right are, there is and I've sort of touched on this earlier, is I think data is getting significantly more complex in the EMIR refit. So I think targeting your data and data models and having appropriate sort of lineage there is going to be critical. I think the regulators are, and they've started to stipulate this already, the regulators are expecting organizations to have improved sort of traceability procedures, etc. So that would be an area which most firms kind of address as a kind of day two problem. I don't think that's something that you could do with EMIR 3.0. And then of course, you've got the additional complexity around just the additional data points. So, pairing, matching, recs, etc. I think that's an area that it's a control piece. It's a expectation from the regulator. You have that in place on day one. And I think that would be another area. So if there's three, I'd say traceability, improved data models, and sort of either upending and replacing what you have today, or significantly improving it to be able to cope with the additional scope, complexity, and the volume of kind of data that's going to have to flow through your pairing, matching, and rec engines.
Tej, I'd probably just take it up a level and say, start your work now. Engage with your counterparties and consider the further book of work that you've got over the next 18 months to 2 years. Start considering your budgets, your resourcing, and the impacts of how you're going to plan in to deliver multiple projects over that timeline with limited resource, which is a challenging point in the industry at this point in time.
And just one final question I'll ask to you, Stephen, is for firms that currently utilize assisted reporting What do you think the impact's going to be for them?
I think assisted reporting will still be there. You know, DTC hubs and Univista will still provide that service. I think key points to consider is, you know, what will the service level agreement be like? You know, what is in place in that service level agreement at this point in time, and likely it will need to be tweaked in some way. You know, the responsibility to report breaches or data issue, you know, is that going to be provided for that by that service, or is that going to come back to the firm? Who's taking responsibility for it? I think those things need to be reviewed. And the other things, you know, the 120 new fields, the pairing and matching, you know, certainly 120 new fields is going to be an internal change, I would assume. Pairing and matching, you know, that may be a service that's provided by, you know, DTC or Univista, for instance, but is it ready for purpose? Does work need to be done up front to start, you know, making sure you're comfortable with that? And, you know, again, and not to labor the point, but ISO standards and, you know, the common data elements are going to be key to that. You know, how set up are these repositories to ensure that they're going to be reporting in similar ways? You know, trade repositories have got just as much work to do to deliver on refit than as, you know, firms that are going to report to them. Brilliant.
Look, conscious time, really appreciate the insights and taking the questions, Stephen and Drew. Sarah, I'll hand over to you.
Great. Thank you, everyone. So finally, just a huge thank you from Capco to the SIO, and thank you to everybody for attending today. It was a really great conversation, and hopefully you found it all useful. As ever, if you do have any follow-up questions, or if you would like to get in touch, just drop any of the Capco team a note, or get in touch with Leah on the SIO side of things. So that's all from me, and thank you again to all of our speakers today. Over to you, Leah.
Thank you everyone for your time and all your questions. I think it was very informative session, thought-provoking as always. There is a lot for us to do as an industry as preparation here. No dates yet, but that doesn't mean that we couldn't start work already. So if there are any questions, comments, anything further you would like to hear from Capco, more than happy to direct you to the right individuals there. And again, any feedback that you have on this session or any future sessions, any other subjects you would like to hear about, we would like to hear from you, from the SIO as well. And hopefully we can partner once again with Capco and any other subjects. Well, thank you everyone. Thank you, Capco. Much appreciated. Thank you, Sarah. And,
no problem. Pleasure as always. Thank you.
Looking forward to another event. Thank you.